The smoke hung thick and acrid in the air, a silent witness to the despair tightening around the throat of the man kneeling on the concrete floor. Vincent Moretti, the silent arbiter of life and death, lifted his hand, the final verdict about to be delivered, when a small, reedy voice cut through the heavy silence, not begging for mercy, but for sustenance. Have you ever seen a man of absolute power freeze, paralyzed not by threat, but by the devastating simplicity of childhood need? That moment of shattering realization is what changed the entire course of this dark story. This tale explores the impossible choice between legacy and humanity. If you connect with stories that dive deep into the emotional core of impossible situations, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We reveal true turning points every week, because the cost of a single small act of kindness in a world built on cruelty is often far greater than the punishment itself. Watch how one desperate plea forces a king to drop his crown. The warehouse air was cold, damp with the smell of old concrete and the faint metallic scent of impending confrontation. Vincent Moretti, known in certain circles simply as Vince, stood framed in the weak light, filtering through a high, grimy window. His bespoke suit and diamond cufflinks seemed jarringly out of place against the industrial backdrop. He was a man accustomed to authority, his silence more terrifying than any shout. He slowly drew a puff from his Cuban cigar, the red ember glowing fiercely, illuminating the grave expression fixed upon his face. Before him knelt Marco Rossi, a man who had served the organization faithfully for a decade, now reduced to a trembling silhouette. Marco had made a severe error. A crucial shipment of untaxed goods had vanished, an error that cost Vince a fortune and, more importantly, prestige. In Vince's world, mistakes were not forgiven. They were paid for, usually in full and with interest. Vince's lieutenant, Sal, stood a respectful distance away, his posture rigid, anticipating the inevitable command. They were waiting for Vince to speak, to pronounce the judgment that would follow Marco's failure. Vince observed Marco, noting the hollows under his eyes, the unhealthy pallor of his skin. This wasn't the look of a man who had intentionally betrayed them. It was the look of desperation. But Vince had to maintain order. If he showed weakness, his entire enterprise would crumble. "Marco," Vince finally said, his voice a low rumble, detached and final. "I told you the rules. They're simple. Loyalty, efficiency, results. You broke all three." He took the cigar from his mouth, the action a signal for Sal to step forward. Sal produced a length of thick canvas rope, ready to begin the severe interrogation process. Vince watched, his jaw tight. He hated this part, but he understood its necessity. The organization thrived on fear and swift consequence. Marco's fate was sealed by the loss he had caused. Just as Sal took the first step toward Marco, the side door, which had been carelessly left ajar, creaked open. A small figure, no older than 10, slipped inside the vast, shadowy space. The boy, dressed in clothes too thin for the chilly air, scanned the room with wide, frightened eyes. He immediately spotted Marco and ran clumsily toward him, tripping slightly over a forgotten pallet. Vince watched the scene unfold, his mind registering the profound breach of security, but his body remained frozen. The boy threw his thin arms around Marco's neck, oblivious to the danger surrounding him. Marco tried weakly to push the boy away, whispering harsh, panicked commands to run, but the child clung tighter. The small intruder, Marco's son, Leo, looked up at Vince, not recognizing the chief of the entire operation, only seeing the most imposing man standing near his threatened father. "Please," "Don't punish him!" Leo cried out, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Please don't punish him. He's hungry. He needed it." The words hung in the air, transforming the calculated atmosphere of violence into something profoundly devastating. The phrase, "he's hungry," seemed to dismantle the very foundation of Vince's power structure. Vince, still holding the cigar between two fingers, felt the heat instantly vanish. He stared at the small boy and the kneeling father. His hand slackened, and the expensive Cuban cigar fell from his grip, hitting the dusty concrete floor with a soft, final thud, the glowing ember extinguishing instantly. Before we continue this story of impossible decisions, tell me, from what city and country are you following this intense narrative? Drop a comment below. Vincent stood motionless, the silence amplifying the frantic breathing of the boy. The smell of expensive cigar smoke, which usually masked everything, suddenly felt thin and insignificant against the sharp, clean scent of the cold, hungry air that Leo had dragged in with him. Vince looked down at the extinguished cigar on the ground, a symbol of his absolute control now lying uselessly in the dust. The revelation was not that Marco had stolen. Vince had already suspected that. The shattering discovery was the reason. Marco hadn't been diverting high-end electronics or narcotics. He had been diverting cheap bulk food shipments. The lost cargo wasn't a malicious act of greed, but a desperate scramble for survival. "What did he need, Leo?" Vince asked, his voice unexpectedly soft, the gravelly edge of authority smoothed out by shock. Sal flinched, recognizing the dangerous shift in the boss's tone. This was not the measured fury they were used to. This was a moment of profound internal reckoning. Leo, still clinging to his father, pointed a small shaking finger towards Marco's coat pocket. Marco tried to pull away, shame flushing his neck and face, but Vince signaled Sal to step back. Sal, confused but obedient, retreated into the shadows. Vince slowly approached Marco and gently reached into the coat pocket. His fingers brushed against something hard and wrapped in brown paper. He pulled it out. 3 bruised, slightly stale dinner rolls and a small half-eaten stick of butter. This was the empire-shaking cargo Marco had sacrificed everything for. Vince felt a cold wave wash over him. He was Vincent Moretti, the man who dictated the price of loyalty and fear across 5 districts. Yet he was contemplating the punishment of a loyal soldier who had stolen basic bread for his child. The weight of his own actions, the lavish lifestyle built on the backs of men like Marco, suddenly pressed down on him. "You stole food, Marco?" Vince asked, his eyes not accusatory, but searching. Marco lowered his head further, unable to meet the boss's gaze. They cut our hours, Don Vince. The medical bills for Sophia. They took everything. I couldn't watch him starve. It was supposed to be the week's surplus from the South Street depot. Nobody was supposed to notice. The surplus. A few dollars worth of stale bread was the cost of this man's life. Vince closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the dusty air. This tiny, desperate act exposed a profound flaw in the organization, its inability to see the humanity beneath the transactions. The boy's plea had cracked the concrete shell of Vince's reality. He had to know the full extent of this vulnerability. If Marco was suffering this way, who else was hiding silent, gnawing need under the cloak of loyalty? This was more dangerous than any rival gang. This was the corruption of his own core principles. Vince stepped back, the roll still in his hand, feeling the soft, doughy texture under his fingertips. He looked at Sal, who stood rigid, trying desperately to process the break in protocol. Marco's transgression was theft, punishable by severe treatment. But the context, the hungry child and the stolen bread, complicated everything. It was a breach that could not be solved with a simple show of force. It required judgment, a quality Vince hadn't needed to use in years, relying instead on pure intimidation. He dismissed Sal with a curt nod, an order that allowed no argument. "Get out. Wait outside. Take the kid with you. Get him a hot meal, something decent, and make sure Marco gets a coffee, black." Sal hesitated, visibly struggling with the sudden change in directive. Taking a kneeling traitor's son for a meal was unheard of. It felt like treason itself. But the look in Vince's eyes, a depth of coldness that transcended mere anger, forced obedience. Sal gently took Leo's hand, easing him away from his father. Leo, clutching the empty stomach that had dictated the fate of the moment, looked back once, confusion mixed with fear. Once alone with Marco, Vince dropped the stale rolls back onto the floor, the sound muffled by the concrete. "Who else, Marco?" Vince's voice was low, resonating with a dangerous quality. "If you, a respected earner, are stealing bread because your child is starving, then the foundation is rotten. Who else is being squeezed this tight? I pay you enough to live." Marco finally looked up, his eyes full of anguish. The overhead, Don Vince. The fees, the percentage cuts for the operations, the protection money, it's all going up. But the families, the wives, and the kids, we get the scraps. We used to be able to rely on the community fund. That's been empty for months. Nobody says anything. They're too afraid you'll think it's defiance. Vince paced slowly, his expensive leather shoes scraping softly against the floor. Marco's words confirmed his greatest fear. The organization was suffering from internal greed, the higher management siphoning off resources meant for the rank and file. This wasn't about Marco's loyalty. This was about the unseen hands choking the life out of his own people. A complication, external and pervasive. The unseen threat, the shadowy figures within his own council, were the real thieves, turning the loyal men into desperate criminals just to survive. Vince had maintained power through strength, but he was losing the war through internal decay. He had to uncover who was truly starving his family. The decision regarding Marco was suddenly irrelevant. A much larger, insidious punishment was due to others. Vince knew he had a silent rebellion brewing, fueled by empty stomachs and cold houses. His reputation was built on his ability to provide, and the internal betrayal had hollowed out that promise. He needed to identify the cancer. His first, most crucial move was to protect Marco, turning his crime into a secret asset. "You tell no one about this conversation, Marco. Not your wife, not Sal, no one. You are still indebted for the shipment loss. That debt is payable, but not in blood. You will work directly for me now. A new assignment. You will be my eyes and ears. You will find out who is skimming from the top, who is tightening the screws on the families." Marco's relief was immediate, but Vince cut it short. "Your biggest risk is not punishment from me, but discovery from them. If my advisors suspect I'm investigating them, they will come for you first. Your loss of the cargo was public. Your reprieve must be silent. You are now playing a dangerous game, Marco. The stakes are everything, your life and Leo's future." The risks escalated immediately. Later that night, Vince held a meeting with his 4 senior capos, men he had trusted for decades, led by the calculating and smooth-talking Benny the Butcher Caruso. Benny had always controlled the distribution and logistics, the very departments where the discrepancies in family funds were occurring. The air in Vince's opulent study was thick with the scent of old leather and tension. Vince tested the waters, referencing Marco's failure in general terms. "The recent lapse in security involving Rossi concerns me. It shows weakness at the bottom. We need a full audit of all family funds, particularly the community allocation. I want to ensure every family is cared for. Loyalty costs less than hunger." Benny's reaction was immediate and carefully measured. "Don Vince, with all respect, an audit now sends the wrong message. It shows distrust. Rossi's failure was due to incompetence, not necessity. We must maintain a firm hand, or others will get ideas. You cannot afford to appear sentimental." Benny's voice held a subtle, dangerous undercurrent. It was a challenge masked as caution. The capo was actively pushing back against any inspection that would expose the financial drain. Vince looked at the men surrounding him, realizing they had become fat and complacent, feeding off the resources meant for the soldiers on the street. Marco's desperate plea had given Vince the insight, but exposing the rot would cost him everything. He knew Benny would start watching Marco immediately, realizing that Marco's survival was the key to Vince's new agenda. The tension was palpable. The organization's power struggle had officially begun, disguised as concern for efficiency. Vince felt the weight of his impossible decision. He had to destroy his inner circle to save the loyalty of the street. "Hey everyone, we're approaching a huge milestone, almost hitting 1,000 subscribers. Your support is what drives us to create these deeply emotional and high-stakes stories. If you enjoy how Vince's world is unraveling, please show your support by subscribing. Help us get to that 1,000 mark, so we can keep bringing you more incredible content like this." 2 weeks passed under a veneer of forced normalcy. Vince kept Marco close, assigning him trivial tasks that masked his true purpose, gathering data on the missing community funds and reporting directly to Vince, bypassing the capos entirely. Marco, driven by the memory of his son's desperate plea and the sudden protection from the boss, worked with quiet intensity. The risk was constant. Every shadow felt like a betrayal, every phone call a potential trap. The tension culminated when Benny Caruso requested a private audience with Vince at a secluded high-end restaurant, far from the usual meeting spots. The polished mahogany of the private room reflected the harsh lighting, making the capo's smile look predatory. Benny did not waste time with pleasantries. "Don Vince," Benny began, swirling the expensive Chianti in his glass, "I'm offering you a clean resolution to the Rossi problem." Vince remained impassive, the ice in his glass tinkling softly. "Marco's debt is being managed." "Managed, perhaps, but not contained," Benny countered, leaning forward. The smell of expensive cologne and wine filled the small space. The whispers are starting. The rank and file are questioning why a thief gets a reprieve while their own dues increase. They are looking at Marco's survival as a sign of weakness at the top. It's creating a dangerous fissure. I believe the only way to solidify your authority and quiet the street is a definitive public consequence. This was the ultimatum. Benny was demanding Marco's life, not as punishment for the bread, but as a political sacrifice to protect the capo's embezzlement scheme and maintain the status quo of fear. Vince realized Benny was not just demanding compliance. He was testing Vince's commitment to the new humanized vision he was forming. If Vince agreed, he would betray the only loyal man left and extinguish the spark of conscience Leo's words had ignited. "I understand your concerns about stability, Benny," Vince replied, his voice level. "But Marco has valuable intelligence about the missing cargo. We need that shipment back before we close the books on him." Benny smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The cargo is long gone, Don Vince, and the only intelligence Marco has now is about desperation. If you let him live, the desperate will multiply. I offer you this solution. Eliminate Marco quietly, show strength, and I will personally stabilize the community funds. We can discuss a temporary pay increase for the street soldiers to quell the murmurs. But Marco must go. It's him, or it's the respect of the entire family. Vince looked at the capo, seeing not a trusted colleague, but a hungry wolf demanding a sacrifice. Benny's offer was the ultimate choice: secure his power by embracing the old cruelty, or continue the dangerous, secret investigation and risk open warfare. Vince knew accepting Benny's deal meant his moral decay was complete. He had to refuse, but he needed a way to buy time. Vince's eyes narrowed slightly, a barely perceptible signal of his internal decision. He had to play Benny's game for a moment. Stability is paramount, Benny. Give me 48 hours. I want to secure a key piece of information Marco has on the external buyers of the stolen goods. If the information is worthless after that, we proceed with discretion, but I handle the details. Benny smiled, satisfied with the temporary victory, though suspicion flickered in his eyes. He knew Vince never delegated the final, crucial step of punishment. But 48 hours was sufficient time to prepare his own contingency. Understood, Don Vince. 48 hours. The family respects firm deadlines. That night, Vince mobilized. He couldn't afford to meet Marco openly. He used a trusted, non-affiliated messenger, an old retired contact, Amelia, to deliver a coded message to Marco. Meet at the usual clock, midnight, bring the figures. But Benny was faster. Having been rejected on his ultimatum, he had immediately initiated surveillance on everyone around Vince, particularly Marco. Benny didn't trust the idea of discretion and wanted Marco silenced permanently before Vince could utilize him further. Marco's home was a small, cramped apartment, reeking faintly of illness and stale food, a grim reminder of the hunger that started this conflict. When Marco arrived home from his minor errands for Vince, he found his wife, Sophia, deeply distressed. The apartment had not been visibly ransacked, but the violation was clear. The air felt heavy, like cold water settling over them. "They were here, Marco," Sophia whispered, gripping his arm tightly. "Two men, clean suits. They asked about you, where you were, who you were seeing. They looked under Leo's bed. They didn't take anything physical, but they made sure I knew they had been here." The men had intentionally left the chaos subtle, a precise and psychological intimidation designed to remind Marco that his family was vulnerable. They hadn't inflicted harm, but the message was louder than any threat. "We are watching. We know where you sleep." The psychological impact was immediate. Marco felt the cold sweat crawl down his back. Benny wasn't waiting for the deadline. He was already pushing Marco to break, to run, or to expose Vince's plan prematurely. Marco knew he couldn't expose Vince's plan, which was designed to save the families. He looked at Sophia, fear in her eyes, then at Leo, sleeping soundly in the corner, finally full after Sal's earlier treat. Marco's decision was firm. He had to meet Vince and deliver the information he had secretly compiled, even if it meant walking into a trap set by Benny's men. The immediate danger was no longer the consequence of theft, but the consequence of loyalty. Vince spent the day meticulously preparing for the confrontation that was now inevitable. Benny was trying to force his hand, but Vince had to survive the next 24 hours to gather the necessary leverage. He had moved Marco and his family earlier that afternoon to a safe house miles away, disguised as an extended work assignment. This action preempted Benny's physical threat, but the psychological damage was done. Vince's strategy hinged on confirming the exact structure of the internal theft. Marco's compiled evidence was thin paper documentation. a series of suspicious wire transfers and altered receipts for food and supply depots. Marco had tracked the funds through 3 dummy corporations, all linked back to a shell company controlled by Benny's trusted accountant, Silvio. It wasn't direct proof against Benny, but it was enough to start an investigation that Benny couldn't immediately shut down. The deadline was the meeting with Marco at the abandoned clock tower at midnight. At 11:30 p.m., Vince was in his secured office, reviewing the financial reports Marco had managed to send ahead via the courier. The numbers confirmed a systematic, cold-blooded deprivation of the organization's lower ranks. The money stolen could have fed dozens of families comfortably. The greed was staggering. Vince felt a searing heat of anger, not just for the theft, but for the profound disrespect shown to his authority and the code of honor, however twisted, they were supposed to uphold. He placed the evidence in a heavy locked briefcase. He knew Benny wouldn't personally come to the clock tower, but he would certainly send an intercept team to stop Marco from delivering any information. Vince called Sal, who was still slightly confused by Vince's erratic behavior, but ultimately loyal. "Sal, I need you to run a diversion," Vince instructed, his tone clipped and professional. "Take the black sedan and drive the old route, the one we used for the East Side pickup. Drive fast, draw attention. I need the streets clean for exactly 15 minutes near the clock tower intersection." Sal hesitated only briefly. "And Marco, Don Vince, what happens to him?" Vince gripped the edge of his desk, the cold metal grounding him. "Marco lives, Sal. If this works, he lives, and so do the principles of loyalty we pretend to honor. If it fails, all that's left is chaos." He took a deep breath, the realization settling in. He was risking his entire empire for a man who stole dinner rolls for his starving child. It was a trade-off that defied all logic in the criminal world, but one that was now utterly necessary for Vince's own moral survival. The confrontation was set, the evidence prepared, and the clock was ticking down to midnight. Thank you so much for following this story so far. We are working hard to bring you emotional narratives like this one, and the best part is, the content is always free. If you want to help us grow and reach that goal of 1,000 subscribers, please tap the subscribe button. Your support makes a real difference and ensures we can keep delivering high-quality videos. The clock tower stood silent, its rusted hands stuck at 3:15, long past any functional use. The area was typically deserted at this hour, filled only with the faint, unsettling smell of damp alleyways and exhaust fumes. Vince arrived in an unmarked town car 5 minutes before midnight, positioned in a shadowed recess where he had a clear view of the intersection. He gripped the heavy briefcase containing the financial documents, the weight of the evidence feeling like the future of his entire organization. Precisely at midnight, the silence was shattered by the distant, frantic scream of tires and the rising wail of sirens. Sal's diversion was active. The noise drew the immediate attention of the 4 dark sedans that had been silently patrolling the surrounding blocks. Benny had sent a substantial intercept team. As the cars peeled away towards the noise, a brief window of opportunity opened. Marco, pale and moving with nervous energy, appeared from the darkness, hugging the side of the abandoned building. He carried a small worn bag containing his final notes and a backup drive. He moved quickly, driven by the urgency of the moment and the constant image of his son's face. As Marco reached the agreed-upon spot, Vince stepped out of the shadows. Marco saw the boss and rushed toward him. They had only seconds. "The flash drive is here, Don Vince," Marco gasped, pulling the small device from his inner pocket. It has the full encryption keys for Silvio's offshore accounts. The details link directly to Benny. All the skimming, it's there. Before Vince could take the drive, the 15-minute grace period expired. A deep throbbing sound of approaching engines returned. Benny's men, realizing Sal's commotion was a deliberate distraction, were doubling back. The streetlights around the clock tower suddenly flickered, plunging the immediate area into near-total darkness, emphasizing the immediacy of the threat. Vince pushed Marco violently towards the relative safety of a service entrance. "Go! Get back to the safe house. I have enough." Marco hesitated, torn between his duty and his survival, but the terrifying sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement forced his hand. He vanished through the service door just as two black sedans slammed to a stop, surrounding Vince. The air grew heavy with menace. Benny's lead enforcer, a muscular, humorless man named Rocco, stepped out. "Don Vince, we were told Marco was attempting to flee. We are here to secure him." Vince stood alone in the cold, holding the heavy briefcase, now containing Marco's flash drive. The atmosphere was oppressive, thick with imminent danger. "Marco is gone. I sent him away. He served his purpose. Now tell Benny that the debt has been settled and the game has changed." The confrontation was unavoidable. Vince was now standing directly in the line of fire, protecting the evidence and the loyalty of the man who risked everything for a piece of bread. Rocco's face was unreadable, trained to mask surprise, but the rigidity of his stance betrayed his alarm. Attacking the Don directly, even in the guise of executing an unauthorized order, was the ultimate breach of protocol. However, Vince was surrounded, outnumbered, and holding the single piece of evidence that could expose Benny. "Don Vince, with all respect, we have direct orders to retrieve the evidence Marco carried," Rocco stated, taking a slow step forward. The air pressure dropped. The world outside the small pool of yellow lamplight ceased to exist. "You have orders from a man whose loyalty is in question," Vince countered, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline spiking through him. "You should remember who signs your checks, Rocco, and who built this entire operation." Rocco faltered, momentarily caught between two powerful loyalties. He was a creature of tradition and hierarchy, and standing against the Don felt like shaking the very pillars of his existence. Yet Benny's offer of power had been substantial. This pause was all Vince needed. He saw the flicker of doubt and seized it. He had always been a master of psychological warfare. "Think about what you are doing, Rocco. You are ready to attack your boss because of a power play over stolen funds. Funds that were meant to feed your own cousins and neighbors. Benny is starving the street to feed his own greed. Marco stole bread because his son was crying out for food. Is that what we have become? Men who punish the desperate and reward the gluttonous?" Rocco's gaze dropped to the ground. He realized Vince knew everything. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was a potential casualty in a financial coup, and his loyalty to Benny might cost him his life, or worse, his soul. The shame of potentially starving his own extended network struck him hard. Vince used this moment of fractured resolve to step back into the shadows of the abandoned building. The briefcase was tucked securely under his arm. He didn't run. He retreated with measured dignity. Rocco, facing a profound moral and organizational collapse, made a choice. He raised his hand, signaling a halt to his men. "Let him go," Rocco muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of Sal's still-active diversion. "We wait for Benny's explicit instruction." Vince vanished into the dense darkness, leaving the capo's men in stunned indecision. He spent the next 3 hours in transit, driving through the deserted, silent streets of the city. stopping only to find a secure, untraceable phone line. This was the dark night of the soul. He was now alone, alienated from his own organization, facing treachery at the highest level, all because of a single devastating request from a hungry child. He realized his power had become a cage, and the only way out was to destroy the structure that had once defined him. The man who cared only for power was gone, replaced by a man burdened by the weight of responsibility. Vince emerged from the seclusion of the dark hours with a chilling clarity. Benny had overplayed his hand by trying to intimidate him, revealing the true scope of his ambition and, more critically, his detachment from the suffering of the lower ranks. Vince knew he could not simply punish Benny. He had to re-establish the core principle of the organization: protection and provision for the family, not exploitation. His approach needed to be decisive and public. He used the secure line to call a series of trusted old guard contacts who were loyal to the idea of the organization, not the current financial structure. These were men who remembered the days when the code meant something more than profit. He scheduled an emergency, unscheduled meeting of the full family council for dawn, a move designed to maximize tension and minimize Benny's ability to organize a defense. At the break of dawn, the capos and their most senior men gathered in the main ballroom of Vince's secluded estate. The room was tense. They knew something enormous had happened. The air crackled with suspicion and anxiety. Benny sat at the head of one table, attempting to project an image of calm, but his eyes darted constantly, searching for any sign of Marco. The smell of fresh coffee and fear hung heavily in the morning light. Vince entered the room, not with thunderous anger, but with quiet, profound authority. He did not sit at the head table. Instead, he stood before the men, placing the heavy briefcase on the polished marble floor. "We have a cancer in the family," Vince announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "A rot that began not with external enemies, but with internal greed. We have forgotten what we are here for: to protect our own." He then detailed Marco Rossi's failure, the loss of the shipment. He spoke of the necessary punishment. He let the tension build, and Benny offered a smirk, anticipating the final expected move. "But the punishment was stopped," Vince continued, locking eyes with Benny. "It was stopped by a child, a boy, Marco's son, who rushed in and begged for his father's life, not because his father was greedy, but because he was hungry. He stole dinner rolls to feed his starving son." Vince's revelation hit the men like a physical blow. The shame was palpable among the working-class soldiers. Then Vince opened the briefcase, revealing the flash drive and the paper trails. He laid out the evidence of Benny's systemic theft, detailing how millions had been siphoned off, leaving the community fund empty and leading to the hunger that drove Marco's desperation. "Benny chose to starve our lowest ranks to inflate his own coffers," Vince stated, his voice now rising with moral indignation. "He demanded Marco's execution not for theft, but to silence the truth of his own betrayal. He pushed me to punish the victim while rewarding the true criminal." The room erupted. The soldiers looked at Benny with murderous disbelief. Benny, cornered, realized his carefully built empire of deception had crumbled. The flash drive was the undeniable proof. The final confrontation was won not with weapons, but with the painful, undeniable truth revealed by a child's plea. Benny stood up, his face flushed a deep crimson, realizing the depth of the trap. He desperately tried to reclaim control, arguing that the evidence was fabricated, a desperate attempt by a failing leader to cover up his own weakness. But the detailed wire transfers displayed on a portable screen were irrefutable. Silvio, Benny's accountant, a nervous man already, crumbled under the intense scrutiny, confirming the scheme. The collective anger of the room turned solely on Benny. Vince did not need to issue a formal execution order. He simply walked away from the screen, letting the evidence speak for itself. Benny Caruso acted alone, driven by avarice, undermining the security of every man in this room. He betrayed the code and the trust of the families we swore to protect. The capos nearest Benny, sensing the inevitable shift in power and realizing their own families had been jeopardized by his actions, moved swiftly. The confrontation was not long or drawn out. The air was filled with suppressed sounds of struggle, a brutal, swift consequence for betrayal. When the silence returned, the tension was replaced by a grim resolution. Benny was neutralized, and the internal corruption that had threatened to dismantle the organization was purged. Vince waited until the room was quiet again, the immediate threat gone. He addressed the remaining men, his voice low and firm. The debt Marco Rossi owes for the lost cargo is officially settled. His actions, driven by a father's desperation, ultimately saved this family from a far greater threat. The true payoff was the immediate, practical shift in the organization's principles. Vince announced sweeping changes. He mandated a full, transparent replenishment of the community fund, overseen by a rotating committee of street soldiers, not capos. He ordered an immediate increase in hardship allowances for low-income families within the organization's reach. The money recovered from Benny's accounts was redistributed where it was most needed, ensuring that no man working for the family would ever have to choose between loyalty and feeding his children again. Vince's ultimate decision, to spare Marco and use him as an anchor for truth, had paid off. It had exposed the betrayal, re-established a moral center, and secured the genuine loyalty of the rank and file, which was worth infinitely more than Benny's millions. The cold, calculating mafia boss was still in charge, but the desperate plea of a hungry boy had permanently altered the core of his rule, proving that sometimes humanity was the greatest currency of all. Months later, a new normal had settled over Vince's organization. The financial restructuring was complete, and the immediate fear of internal betrayal had subsided, replaced by a cautious respect for the Don's unexpected turn towards justice. The community fund, now generously replenished, was visibly helping the families in need, fostering a loyalty that pure fear could never achieve. The system was still brutal, but it was no longer cannibalistic. Marco Rossi was appointed to a newly created, highly sensitive position, overseer of family welfare. His office was small, Spartan, but centrally located, symbolizing his elevated status and his new importance. His job was to ensure the operational integrity of the financial system, acting as Vince's conscience and primary informant regarding the well-being of the rank and file. His pay was substantial, reflecting his sacrifice and new responsibility. Vince kept a respectful distance from Marco, recognizing that Marco's loyalty was earned through trauma and respect, not proximity. Marco's wife, Sophia, was recovering, her medical bills paid in full, and Leo, the small catalyst of this immense change, was thriving. One crisp autumn afternoon, Vince found himself revisiting the old warehouse. He was there for an unrelated meeting, but as he stood in the damp, empty space, his eyes involuntarily drifted to the spot where Marco had knelt. He saw the faint, dark stain on the concrete where the glowing Cuban cigar had fallen and died. That small patch of dust and ash felt like the grave of his former self, the self that had prioritized arbitrary rules over fundamental human need. Later that day, Vince was back in his high-rise office, the city sprawling beneath him. He was discussing logistics with Sal, who had quietly observed Vince's transformation without comment. As their meeting concluded, Sal placed a small, elegantly wrapped gift on Vince's massive oak desk. "It's from Marco, Don Vince, for your birthday. He insisted I deliver it personally." Vince opened the small box slowly. Inside was a brand-new hand-rolled Cuban cigar, perfect and expensive. Alongside it lay a small, slightly dented copper coin, the type a child might find and treasure. There was a handwritten note from Leo, scrawled in clumsy crayon. "Thank you for the food, Don Vince. We are not hungry anymore." Vince looked at the cigar, then at the coin and the note. He had spent his life accumulating power and wealth, yet this small coin, a symbol of a child's gratitude and a simple promise kept, was the most valuable thing he had ever received. He reached for the cigar, but instead of lighting it, he placed it carefully back in the box. He would never again use a cigar as a tool of intimidation or an instrument of final judgment. The Mafia Boss had found a new, terrifying balance. Power tempered by a profound, life-altering understanding of human vulnerability, all thanks to a small boy's desperate cry. The emptiness was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of purposeful responsibility.